We're just gonna wait a couple of extra seconds. We can probably start very, very soon. But meanwhile, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, the city, the government or organization that you work for, and for how many years you've been working on urban planning, urban development, and on informal settlements. So I think we can start with just a couple of minutes after the half hour. So welcome to a critical discussion that addresses one of the most pressing challenges facing Africa today, the rapid urban growth and imperative need to improve informal settlements through sustainable urban planning. I'm Viola Follini. I'm the Urban Shift Project Manager at C40 Cities, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to this insightful webinar. The webinar is organized by Urban Shift in collaboration with C40 Cities, Land Use Planning Network. So Urban Shift is a partnership supported by the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, led by the UN Environmental Programme and delivered by WRI, the World Resource Institute, C40 Cities, ICLE, UNDP, the World Bank, and ADB. Before we start the discussion, just a couple of reminders. So we do offer live simultaneous English to French interpretation, and you should be able to switch between the English and French channel at the bottom of the Zoom screen by clicking on the interpretation button. If you have any issues, please let us know in the Zoom chat box, and our team will be able to support you. After the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A section with questions from you, the audience. So please use the Q&A chat box to add your question throughout the webinar. Just let us start. As cities across Africa experience unprecedented expansion, informal settlements have become a focal point, often leaving vulnerable communities without access to essential services and infrastructure. Today, we stand at a pivotal moment where our approach to urban development can redefine the future for millions. To navigate the complexities of these issues, we have gathered experts from UN Habitat, C40 Cities, the city of Freetown and Durban. Together, we aim to explore sustainable planning strategy that can pave the way for equitable and resilient cities. Through this webinar, we will delve into their strategies, the challenges and successes, offering valuable insight that can inspire change across the continent and other regions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our keynote opening speaker, Robert Louis Lexington, the head of housing, land and slum upgrading at UN Habitat. Over to you, Robert, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Viola. I hope you can hear me okay. Splendid. It's always good when the technology works. I will keep my comments relatively brief and allow the main presenters to bring out some of the greater detail of what's been achieved and what is going on the ground. But to make a few points from the sort of global view that Habitat is responsible for as a way of setting the framework is where I'll try and focus my attention. So first, to emphasize that there is a tendency still to see informal settlements and slums as a problem that needs to be fixed. I think we need to make sure that we reverse this and not think of them as black holes or challenges or difficulties. Think of them as solutions to particular problems that people are creating for themselves. It's a question of affordable housing. It's a question of the location of the housing in relation to economic opportunity. It's a question of community. It's a question of certain types of social support and services that communities are not able to get from other places. And informal settlements and slums frequently provide some of the options here. That then, you know, this is a question of how things fit into the urban fabric. And it's part of the challenges that lead to this are caused by physical planning. They may also be solved by it, of course, as a consequence of that. But when we take too rigid an approach to our physical planning, when we we prioritize our theory over our practice, then we end up having to squeeze greater and greater numbers of people into informal situations. So there is a very strong relationship between the two. I think that gives the clear message that planning needs to make sure that it doesn't exclusively focus on how informal settlements fit into its approach and its structures. It also needs to focus on the essential elements that need to be delivered for rights. And among that, I would include safety issues as a major indicator in urban development and a major influencer of what happens over other issues. And also spatial planning, physical planning needs a strong awareness of what its direct and indirect consequences are. If we're not planning residential areas in a way in which they can accommodate the people who exist, the people who are going to be demanding space and the resources that they have available and that the public has available to support them, then we're going to continue to face challenges. On that basis, I would also say we've had a lot of success in pinpoint and project style interventions in informal settlements, upgrading here and there, regularization there, particular elements of community engagement. And those have taught us a lot, and they are very, very positive experience. Every life that is touched and improved is a success. But it is also clear that we are not going to achieve the kind of things we need to through these kinds of project interventions alone. We need systemic change at a very large scale, city by city, but also within a national framework. The city by city element I emphasize because of the question of what I would term spatial and social equity. How is the space in a city divided up? In too many cases, we have cities with relatively or very low densities of 2,000-3,000 per square kilometer equivalents. But yet in those same cities, we have also a significant underuse compared to planned densities in the urban core. So there is a lot of space available, and yet we are squeezing between 30 and 70% of our population into 5% or less of the land area. Clearly, this is not an equitable approach, and it is the excuse that it is driven by property rights and the regime of rights that we have isn't enough to say that we shouldn't be taking public intervention to change that. We can do it through taxes, through fees, different ways, through land banking, all sorts of different things. In that line, we also know what's coming. We have a good idea in terms of population dynamics of the levels of population growth that we are likely to expect, particularly in the youth who tend to be capital poor and not have access to the resources to secure their own housing early on. We also have a fair idea of where they're going to go, particularly in Africa. We have a long road of urbanization ahead of us. Most countries are somewhere between 30 and 50% urbanized at the moment. We know from historical example in other regions that is going to increase to 70 to 80%. So we have rapid growth within cities, plus we still have large numbers of people who are moving into cities from rural areas. We cannot focus just on the existing informal settlements and slums for where our interventions will take place. We have to look at where these people are going to go in future and what the cities of the future are going to look like. And that has to depend upon a physical planning strategy. There is no way around it. All of this needs to be based very much on the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, which includes the right to an adequate standard of living and the question of minimum treatment. All states have a minimum obligation towards their citizens under the covenant, and there is also a commitment to gradual improvement. So we do recognize informal settlements and slums currently do provide a level of housing, but it is one that we need to improve, and we need to be able to accommodate more people within that framework. So it is a clearly rights-based approach to work in this way. That brings up very quickly public versus private commitment. Now, there is a lot of tendency to place emphasis on private financing, And that is important, but that tends to be important for the wealthier sectors of the population. It will work where you've got informality because of building control issues and things like that. But informality for the urban poor is going to require a public commitment to securing finance, which is going to affect local government financing, central government transfers to local government. As we know from all regions of the world, there is the tendency of national government to pass on the obligation for providing housing, including for the homeless, but then not to pass on the resources that are equivalent to do that. And too many cities are depending on very, very low resource and revenue bases. You cannot provide a housing system based on advertising revenues or parking fees or market stall fees. We need to look at property taxes. We need to look at larger scale long-term finance. Coming to my final comments now, I recognize I'm at time and I know Viola will be anxious. This means political commitment and a long-term view are essential. Cities are shaped, I remember as our former executive director used to like to point out, many European cities still have the same road plan they had in Roman times. Cities do not change some of their basic elements very quickly. We need to look over the long term, maybe not over 2,000 years, but certainly over 20, 30 plus. And we need to really plan for growth in an effective manner and plan for inclusive growth and to look at what the resource strategies are to achieve that and be honest about where we don't have the resources and work out, place a focus on that to look for other solutions. Finally, I would just like to highlight at the recent Habitat Assembly, we had a couple of resolutions on this issue, one on slum transformation, one on adequate housing, where we finally have more of an opportunity for member states to pay consistent attention to housing. There has never been a global forum looking at housing, a governmental forum looking at housing before. This is a big opportunity. And we have on slum transformation in particular an outline of 10 action points. They are somewhat generic, land, finance, some of the things that you would expect to see, but they do provide a framework that we can work on and flesh out. And good planning is an essential part of that. So we hope that we can work with C40 and all of the other partners here in taking that forward into the future and filling out the details. Thank you again, and I look forward to following the rest of the discussions today.
Great. Thank you very much, Robert, for your insightful points. I'm happy to also say that Robert will stay for the Q&A sections as well. So we'll have it for that part as well. So on to our panel discussion. I'll introduce the moderator, Alice Kaumba. She's the Senior Manager for the Urban Planning and Design at C40 Cities. Over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Thank you, Viola. It's a pleasure to have you all joining us today. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We are lucky to be joined today by two panelists, one from the city of Freetown and another colleague from the city of equitably municipality. So I'll introduce Claire. Claire Norton is the Senior Manager Land Use Management of equitably municipality. Claire has over 25 years experience in town and regional planning, with extensive experience in statutory planning, public participation, and integrated development planning. Claire has worked for both private and public sector, and in the public sector, she initially worked with Eastern Ghatan Service Council, and her focus was on rural development, and in particular, spatial development and integrated planning. As mentioned, Claire is currently the Senior Manager Land Use Management at the equitably municipality, and is responsible for the management of the land use themes that guide and land use schemes that guide and regulate development in accordance with applicable planning legislation and municipal strategic plans and policies. Our next panelist is Modupe Williams from Freetown Municipality. Modupe has over 30 years experience in providing strategic support to city authorities and development cooperation in developing and implementing urban planning policies in creating more sustainable cities. This extends to the planning and delivery of major infrastructure projects linked to sustainability and economic development of cities. More recently, He has promoted the cable car as a cost-effective and sustainable transport solution for the city of Freetown. He's currently leading the delivery of a neighborhood upgrading, local area plan, and the CBD regeneration program at Freetown City Council. Welcome our panelists. I'll start with first question to Modupe. Modupe, you know that you are adopting a strategic approach to slum improvement in Freetown. Can you elaborate on the overarching approach that Freetown has adopted in addressing informal settlement? And what key principles guide this effort? And how do these align with the broader goal of sustainable urban development within the city? Over to you, Modupe.
Thank you very much, Alice, for the introduction, and thanks for the question. Maybe I'll set the context of Freetown. Freetown as a city has very limited planning controls managed by the city council. So the informal settlements have grown as a result, mainly by two things: a result of lack of any form of planning controls, and also a huge displacement that happened in Sierra Leone during the 10-year-long civil war of the 90s. That moved a large number of people into the city, and that growth of population has continued beyond the end of the war up until today. So that's the background context. So we have a fairly relatively small city that's with pressure for housing from other parts of the city, of the country. And what we as a city are seeking to do is to begin to address some of those problems that people in informal settlements face, communities in informal settlements face, through an upgrading of the most critical of our informal settlements. Informal settlement upgrading is a long-term process. It's very difficult to achieve that with a single series of interventions. And so we are using a planned approach. We are developing area action plans to inform and guide our planned approach to developing and addressing the problems of informal settlements. Area action plans is our attempt to retrofit some of the most deprived and vulnerable communities in order to improve the living conditions and the general amenities, and create a reasonable level of existence for those populations. And primarily, we look to address issues of exposure to various forms of risk. As mentioned previously, some of the communities are in areas which are highly prone to flooding, and other of these informal settlements are in areas which, again, in the hillsides, they're exposed to landslides. So area action plans are developed with the full participation of the affected communities. And we also engage with government departments and stakeholders in order to ensure there is complete buy-in from all the stakeholders. And we develop these plans where there's opportunity for the interventions to be funded. So the scale of the problem by far exceeds the resources that we have. So often when we seek to plan an area, we plan those areas for which we have identified a catalyst resource base that would help us begin to address the most significant problems. We typically adopt a 5-stage process in developing area action plans. So the first stage, we describe it as setting out the vision and the principles for development. And once that's been established, we then go on to the next stage by doing a fairly detailed assessment of the critical issues that communities experience, the topography of the location, and the wider land use implications that we want to address through a more collaborative planned approach. And then we start to, with engagement with the local community groups, we begin to develop strategies and options for possible solutions to the problems that we have identified in the previous stage. Then we create detailed plans, which we then take out for consultation, and we start the statutory process of adopting these plans as statutory planning instruments. One thing I should also add at this point, the planning legislation in Sierra Leone is over 50 years old. It has not been updated. So a lot of what we are trying to do is not captured within the legislative framework. The planning legislation is currently under review at the present time. So a lot of the work we're doing, we're picking best practice from other cities, both within the region and wider, and trying to see how we can learn from other cities' experience in addressing problems within our informal settlements. So the area action plan, as I said previously, is the lowest level of planning that we do within, and is primarily done within informal settlements or in other commercial areas. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Modupe, for that response. A reminder to our participants that you please put the questions you might be having in the Q&A box. We'll have a chance to respond to them later. Over to you, Claire. Could you please elaborate on the overarching approach that eThekwini municipality is undertaking in relation to slum upgrading, based on the eThekwini informal settlement incremental upgrading strategy that the municipality adopted in 2019? And what key principles guide these efforts? And how do these align with the broader goals of sustainable urban development within the city? Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Alice, and welcome to all the participants on the webinar today. It certainly is a great opportunity to share some of the work that we are doing down here in Durban, which falls within the eThekwini municipal area. In discussing our policy regarding informal settlements, the first point of departure that as a municipality we had was to look at the various sustainable development goals. And coming out of the goal of resilience and sustainable development, Durban then developed a strategy called the Durban Resilience Strategy. And as part of that strategy, a policy was created, which was formally then adopted by Council in 2017. Now, as part of the strategy, and certainly in terms of resilience, one of the underlying and overarching principles was the fact that in order for a city to be resilient, we would have to focus on how we're going to deal with the informal settlements that are currently within the municipal area, and how was that approach going to be taken forward. In terms of our informal settlements, one of the overarching policies was to focus on the existing infrastructure that was available, as well as the coordination and looking at innovation in terms of this within the space of informal settlements. The overarching guidelines on a more strategic level was looking at the fact that we needed to elevate informal settlements to be a strategic municipal priority. And this comes back to the fact of not trying to ignore them, and to say that informal settlements within the municipality had on many occasions been there for over 20 or 30 years, and that we needed to actually deal with the reality of where they were and where they're located. And in order to do that, we had to strengthen also within the city, how do we manage and govern the reality around informal settlements, often of which are on land that's been invaded or that the occupiers do not own, and that would require a change in institutional arrangements as to how the city would then view and deal with the community and assist them with trying to move forward in terms of this. The other issue that we needed to look at was the fact that we had very little data on who the inhabitants of informal settlements were, how many they were, as you know, being informal and quite transitory at stages. You would find that it was difficult to collect that data, and that became a focus as well, was to actually collect accurate data. And also to look at saying that even though they are informal, they needed to be sustainable and they needed to be climate smart. And this has become far more relevant certainly for Durban since the floods of 2022, which led to the fact that a lot of the deaths we experienced were within informal settlements. So that has become a very urgent priority for us. And then also having a system built in that would look at how we monitor and action the proposed projects that were being done, because there's no doubt that what we found was that we had to change our conventional approach to informal settlements, and that it wasn't just about providing alternative housing, but it was about actually saying these communities are there, they need to be upgraded, how are we going to do that? And we took the approach of incremental upgrading, which is really the overarching policy and guideline for how we're going to deal with the informal settlements. We also needed to accept that we were not going to be able to upgrade and change a lot within the informal settlements in the short to medium term, and we have to take a long-term view on the upgrade, because you need to engage with the communities, you need to build that trust, you need to have that community compact in place, and also we would need to decide which the priority was within the informal settlement, which was more about providing infrastructure and essential services such as water and electricity and sewage disposal. But in order to do that, how you're going to, look at how you can get the community to assist you in those provisions. Also, rather to look at selecting the informal settlements that we felt were most appropriate for upgrading at the first stage, and also to focus on that, and to have a focused approach around
Hello, Claire. Hello.
I think there's a connection issue, Alice, so maybe we can move to
Yeah,
the next.
we can move to the next question, and I'll pass this question over to you, Modupe. So could you tell us, in addressing how informal settlements, how do you engage with the stakeholders in the informal settlement upgrading that you do in Freetown? Modupe, are you here? Can you hear us? Hello, Modupe.
I could hear you. Hello. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
The question I have to. Did you get the question?
Yes, I got the question. The
All right.
question was around the how do we engage with the communities that we are working with in upgrading the informal settlements. Yes, we work through reliable and trusted CBOs in leading the community engagement. And with the two communities that I'll be describing or talking about, one, we're working through a CBO, the Slum Dwellers Association. And the second, we're working through the consultants team that's doing the community engagement. But the council as an authority had also reached out to the local communities in trying to capture from these communities what their felt needs are. And through a series of community meetings, community engagement, community workshops, we get a deep and a broad understanding of what the issues are and what the communities are prepared to accept as possible solutions to their problems. As has been mentioned previously, the biggest concern for many of these communities is the issue of land tenure and ownership rights. It's a significant concern, which sometimes when authorities try to engage with these communities, there is a bit of resistance, if you like, to disclosing their concerns. But when you're working through a trusted CBO who has had the experience of working with these communities, you're able to get a clearer picture of their needs and to begin to see what is possible as a solution in the short term. So that's the first stage. But the next stage on beyond the community engagement is then, as I said previously, is to begin to generate possible solutions, workable solutions, which fits within the scope and the budget of the currently planned interventions. And the area action plan allows us to have a series of or program of planned interventions over a longer period. For example, if the upgrade plan is only over an 18-month period with a very limited budget, we will try working with the communities to prioritize those needs which are urgent and need to be addressed as soon as possible. And we can also with the communities develop a plan for future interventions. For example, I think I mentioned previously we had two informal settlements, one on the coast in Cockle Bay and one on the hillside in Moiba. The coastal community, a part of that community has been built up through backfilling of fractured material to create land for housing on the coastline. And that community has been exposed to a series of flood events in the last five or so years. And as a city, we want to reduce this risk that this community is being exposed to. So what we have developed with the community is a plan that shows how we can reblock the land allocation within that space and try to identify suitable and more and safer land for housing on ground that's more secure and less likely to be flooded. Housing and raising finance for housing is quite a major step, and we are, as a council, looking at financing, affordable housing financing options, both from the private sector and other NGOs and donor agencies that are prepared to put money into affordable housing for our less our deprived communities in the city. So a basic upgrade will entail providing infrastructure that reduces the poor access, minimizes the risks from climate change by preventing housing or new housing in areas prone to flooding, and also tries to address the type of building material that that people in informal settlements tend to build their houses from. And they tend to use tin shed, metal sheets, and these are very, very hot, and they create with the rising temperature, these houses become unbearable places to live in. So we have been working with another NGO that's looking to build affordable housing using locally made bricks as an alternative to tin shed housing, and where the council is able to secure financing for housing, these are the kinds of options we'll be looking at.
Thank you very much, Modupe.
Over to you, Alice. Yeah.
Thank you for elaborating how it's important to work with a grassroots organization in informal settlement upgrading. So I'll ask one question to Claire. Claire, thanks for joining back. In addressing informal settlement, and we know from the figures that Viola mentioned before, that about 230 million people in Africa live in informal settlement by 2020. And this is going to increase us because Africa is the most urbanizing continent. From your experience planning with informality in equitably, what is your key message for cities addressing informality as well? What would you tell cities to focus most on, or what advice would you give any city practitioner that's also working with informality? Claire?
Thank you, Alice. I'm glad to be back. Our load shedding is quite something that we have to deal with as well here. I think if we're discussing, dealing with informality and certainly informal settlements, and my advice to other municipalities or cities, I think one of the most important principles is the fact that they are here to stay, and they are part of our fabric of our community and part of our urban landscape. And it is important as planners that we find ways to integrate them into our broader planning. The nice to haves and the urban design and the pretty plans that we do are also important, but the informal settlements also have a dynamic and a culture of their own that can introduce many different ideas in terms of planning. So I think the most important point is plan for informality. Formal settlements are there. There are communities there that have been there for many, many years. And there's a lot to be learned from them and how they deal with the day-to-day challenges of infrastructure or the lack thereof. And the fact is that we've got a lot to learn from them. I think my other point, very much from a governance or institutional point of view, would be that within a city or municipality, you definitely need to have the buy-in from, the executive level of the municipality. You need to have both, whoever's at the head of the municipality saying that informality and informal settlements are a priority and that they need to be focused on and get the important planning and infrastructural allocations that they require. This means that, you know, politically and governance and institutionally, the acceptance of informality and informal settlements needs to come from the top. And you need to know that whatever you're doing is being supported by the management within whatever organizational structure that you are in. And then I think finally, and maybe it should have been the first point, we are working with communities and planning for communities. If you do not get the buy-in from them and the correct social compact, then any plans that you do actually are going to be futile. So those are the 3 points I would say are really important for anybody to consider. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you, Claire, for that elaboration. And I'll go to the Q&A session. There are a few questions in the chat box for us. This first question is for Robert from UN Habitat. And this question is from Desire of Kati Habwa. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name well. The question is, in a world with a growing population, how can we plan sustainably to manage the demand for land space for food production and homes? Over to you, Robert.
Thank you. I think the first and most important thing is that we don't, in terms of space, we don't have as many shortages as we tend to think we do. The question is how we are allocating the space that we have available. What has tended to happen is that we are allocating space on a property rights and an economic logic that doesn't include everybody and doesn't adequately value the social function of property and land. I know that's the easy dogmatic approach, but I think at a practical level, what we also have to do is look at how, from a policy point of view, we discourage suboptimal use of space. So lower densities or activities that could be shifted elsewhere. For example, a lot of cities have a legacy of space taken up with infrastructure or light industrial activities that would be more appropriately relocated to other areas. And there are different ways of incentivizing, shifting that around, freeing up that land. It can be financial measures. It can also be land banking and different strategies like that can be taken forward. And a lot of that can be done in close cooperation with communities through cooperatives and different site and servicing approaches, different structures like that. So I think there are ways, and I think the fear of the lack of land and space is often used more as an excuse than it really is a genuine problem. Although I will admit that from a planner's point of view and a developer's point of view, it may feel like there is a shortage because the political decisions are not being made to give them the space to work with that they need. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Thank you, Robert. And this another question for Modupe. Modupe, the question is asking, thank you for insights on Freetown. I would like to find out whether you could share some reflections, anecdote on how you or stakeholders in Freetown have navigated the lack of up-to-date legislation in order to make changes or implement projects, especially given the many changes that we have seen globally around how we navigate informality. Modupe?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks for the question, Alice. Yes, I think we are at the start of the process here in Freetown. We have tried different interventions with our informal settlements. and they've often been very much around the area of relief. So when disaster, then we've tended to mobilize in the past, mobilize resources to address the immediate impact of that event. But now I think as a city, we recognize that informality is here to stay, and we need to find ways to address the most significant risks. And as I mentioned previously, these are perceived as the basic access to these facilities, access for emergency services, providing water and sanitation to these communities, also exploring opportunities for alternative sources of livelihood. For example, one of the hillside communities there's a lot of reliance on stone mining as an activity, but the consequential impact of that is the stone mining results in dislodging the topsoil and leads to and causes as a cause of landslides. So finding alternative sources of livelihood for these communities can start to help address some of the environmental and problems in these communities. So the scale of the problem by far exceeds the resources. So what we feel having the plans in place allows us to be able to deploy resources more cost effectively once we were able to identify the resource. But if you have no plan, then you sometimes don't use the resource to best advantage because you've not thought through carefully what's the most advantageous intervention that you can implement in that particular location. So having upgrading plans or area action plans for each of these informal settlements would allow us to respond more targeted approach in addressing some of the problems of informality.
Thank you, Modupe. We have another question for both of you, Modupe and Claire. And this one is about resettlement of population when upgrading informal settlements. So in most cases, resettlement is supposed to avoid as best as possible the resettlement of people. And this means that the upgrading of informal settlements should be in situ, or the resettlement should be close to where people initially lived. Please, how does the cities deal with upgrading activities amidst resettlement concern in your cities? How have you been dealing with this concern of resettlement? Claire, you can start, and then Modupe can quickly also respond. If you can do it quickly in 2 minutes each, it would be appreciated.
Thank you. Yes. So where we do have to resettle and how we've had to deal with it is, first of all, the resettlement has been areas that have just proven to be too dangerous for communities to continue to live in. And we've decided that the upgrade cannot happen there. In terms of resettlement, our biggest challenge, in fact, has been about finding or identifying the most appropriate land. And as you say, closest to work opportunities, etc. So there's quite a lot of involvement around, once the land is identified, then engaging with the community as to whether that in fact is going to work. It's quite a process. You can't just resettle people if they're not going to be able to have be close to economic activities. But it's certainly a challenge finding appropriately located land where we've had to resettle. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you. Modupe, could you quickly respond on how you deal with resettlement?
Yeah, I can only respond from the point of view of what our plans are. We don't have many examples of successful resettlements in Freetown. There were earlier resettlement programs which were not successful. The current plans are to address resettlement issues, as Claire pointed out, is to move people away from areas which are unsafe, like areas prone to flooding, and then look for higher density housing within the same locality. So most of these informal settlements occupy relatively large areas of land, but it's very low density. They're all single-story dwellings. So we're looking to see if we can, through design and build better higher density infrastructure for low cost, we can get some kind of resettlement and tenure rights, which would be acceptable to these communities.
Thank you. And we have another question for Robert. Robert, this participant asking, I would like to get the UN Habitat view on the high number of planned African cities and formation of informal settlements stroke slums, despite the introduction of participatory slum upgrading by UN Habitat. So is asking why is there still a lot of slum being formed in Africa, and yet UN Habitat had introduced this participatory slum upgrading approach to which the cities need to have adopted, and national governments. Over to you, Robert.
Yeah, all the tough questions are coming now, aren't they? I think I would first like to stress that, as has been shown by the comments of Claire and Madupe, cities are doing a lot. There is the backlog of what needs to be done goes back a very, very long way. We first started looking at these issues as the UN in the 1950s, and then more in the 1960s as we got newly independent states. And there was a huge backlog of discrimination and inclusion, where huge proportions of the population in many countries were just not considered at all. And if they were, very minimally. So there are many examples of cities doing what they can to try and catch up with this. But of course, it's just simply not possible that they can do it all on their own. It needs to be done within a wider framework. We feel that we have proved, not as Habitat, but with all of our partners, and both Sierra Leone and South Africa, I would say, have been very, very active partners in our programs. We have proved what works and what needs to be done from the community level up. We know what the technical solutions are. We know what the options are. The problem remains getting the political commitment and the scale that we need to really address the issue. That starts with basic questions, unfortunately, around the structure of finances and wealth within a state. If you don't go in at that level of taxation and the broad national structure to look at where does long-term sustainable money come from, then there's a limited amount that you can do, particularly when you're looking at 30, 40, 50% plus of your population who are in need of some kind of support. When you look historically at the examples of where countries succeed, it is where there is a greater level of national solidarity about we are going to do something about this and we are going to invest in it. So I think I would say the reason we're not having the impact is we still haven't overcome the political will side and the social solidarity side and the legacy of some of the slightly restrictive and coercive frameworks around planning, around building regulation and some of these things. We are getting there, we are making progress, but the scale of the challenge makes that very difficult. And we know what the technical solutions on the ground are in most cases. We can provide tangible examples of those. So we've just got to get the scaling up and the resources available to do that. And that's where the real block is, particularly at the moment, because many governments have a whole lot of other priorities and a whole lot of other pressures. So it is a question of maneuvering around that and getting it centrally on the table. Housing, as you will probably all be aware, is not the most powerful ministry in any country. If you are going into any situation, the most powerful ministry is Treasury. And if you cannot get Treasury on board, you are only ever going to go so far. Lots of people are trying, and we need to keep that moving. Thank you.
Thank you all for responding to the questions. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to go through all the questions, but we will make sure that we send this over to our speakers and get the feedback back to the those who asked. So I'll hand it over back to Viola to introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much. Over to Viola.
Great. Thank you very much, Alice. And to all the speakers, this has been a very, very insightful discussion and conversation. So we're on to our final part of this webinar. So I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Mateus Ortega, Senior Manager at Urban Shift from C40 Cities. Over to you, Mateus. Thank you.
Thank you, Viola. And before you go, I'd like to announce 3 very interesting products that Urban Shift has developed. 2 of them are online courses that are free, that are in 6 different languages, and that can be accessible by anyone. So you can please pass the next slide and show that this is a very interesting course on accommodating urban growth that C40 developed together with New York University. These courses took around 2 years to be developed, so there's a lot of gathering of case studies, examples, and the courses have around 8 hours of content. So you can access the course by getting your phone and scanning this QR code, or you can click on the link that is on the chat. This specific online course, we have 8 different courses, but this specific one is talking exactly about this that we were discussing in this webinar. So it's very relevant to the audience. However, we also have other courses, and I wanted to highlight one other one. So you can pass on to the next slide, which is called Integrated Climate Action Planning. This is also quite relevant here because here we're talking about what are the resilience strategies, what are the mitigation strategies that cities are taking in order to tackle both urban growth and development and climate change. And here we have examples from several cities, including Freetown and cities from the Global South. These courses are very much tailored to the Global South. So if you're from a Global South city, please feel free to enroll in these courses, as there is a lot of learning. They're very relevant things from cities that have experienced this work. So my final information is another product that Urban Shift has developed, which is the public-private collaboration. It's to accelerate sustainable urban development. It's a guide for Global South cities, featuring several examples, 30 examples from Global South cities that show the connection between the private sector and the public sector on how to drive sustainable development. So these are the 3 news for you. And I hope that this is inspiring. This can be useful for you in your work in your city. So that's it in terms of informations, and I'll pass it back to Viola to conclude the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Mateus. And thank you, all of you, for joining us to this webinar. Very special thank you to our speaker, Robert, Claire, Modupe, and of course, to our moderator, Alice and Mateus as well. So thank you all. And we hope to see you in the next webinars that Urban Shift will organize. You will receive invitations by email, and we'll make sure to be in touch and share the recordings from this webinar. Thank you very much, all of you, and we can close this webinar now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.